They are theological opportunities. Please welcome Bob Jaeger as he comes and leads us. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Poe. It was a pleasure to work with you on that podcast when you were at Wesley. How many years ago was that now? 5 years ago? Oh my goodness, that was great. And this is my second time to Tulsa and my first time to Phillips. And it's an honor. You'll soon learn more about my work when I share more about Partners for Sacred Places. My degree is in preservation, as Dr. Poe just said. So architecture is one of the things I love, but our work is about more than just the object, the building. It's about how it serves as an asset and as a resource, as an inspiration for you and for your community. We'll talk about that. But architecture is one of my loves, and so I went downtown last night to eat at Noche. Any of you from this area know Noche? Good restaurant. And then I walked into the core of downtown. Wow, some great buildings downtown. So what is Tulsa most known for? Art Deco. And why does Tulsa have so much great Art Deco? Oil. We all know that story, right? Oil was discovered in the area, and so Tulsa has one of the greatest concentrations of Art Deco architecture in the world. And per capita, probably more good Art Deco buildings than any other city. So it was astonishing, and I walked around and looked at the Mid-Continent building and the Bank of Oklahoma building and peered into their lobbies, and in the distance I saw Boston Avenue Methodist Church. Wow. You all are blessed. For those of you who work or live, I know some of you are alumni and coming from other places, but for those of you who visit or live here, wow, what a special place. So it was an honor. So I have a couple questions for you as I start and share something about our work and what we've learned. How many of you, raise your hands, how many of you are pastors or assistant pastors? Most of you. How many of you are chaplains or serve in some other capacity? Okay, I've met 2 or 3 of you who are chaplains. So here's a question for all of you, but maybe for the pastors especially. Are church buildings mostly a burden or mostly a blessing? Okay, so let's take a show of hands. Are they more of a burden? Whoa, all right. We have to unpackage that. So a number of you say burden. So, how many of you think it's more of a blessing? So it's kind of maybe somewhere, okay. Well, I see some people saying, well, it's really both, Bob. How many say it's both? All right, we all say that, right? Well, there's a story to tell there, I think. Right. Yes. We were just talking about congregations that don't want change, and we were talking about different traditions. And I was saying, I think to Jenny or someone that I think the Episcopalians are the most at the top of the list for those congregations that do not want to change, particularly the chancel area. They do not want to change. It's very difficult to make change. So that's a challenge everywhere, right? So here's another question before I begin. Do you think sacred places, churches, have a civic value? Do they have a value to the larger community beyond your membership? Okay. We're going to talk a lot about that today because we have learned a lot about that value. We can document some of that value. We can measure some of that value. I think there are ways for congregations to discern that, to document it, and to tell that story. We really believe very strongly that congregations need to discern and to communicate their civic value in new ways. Because, and again, we'll get into details in a minute, but we believe very strongly in an era when so many congregations are smaller, that there needs to be ways to get the larger community interested and to tell a story about your value to those around you. Because quite frankly, we need them. We need their help. We need their involvement. We need their funding. And maybe we need their help to rethink and reimagine our spaces. So yeah, I'm a preservationist, but I do realize that we need to adjust and change and evolve as we're smaller, and that provides opportunities. So it's not all bad. So anyway, it was really fun to walk around Tulsa and get a sense of what you have here and think about some of these things. So the title of this talk today was Challenging Times and Yet Also Hopeful Times for Sacred Places and for congregations and your buildings. What did Dickens say at the beginning of one of his novels? It was the worst of times and it was the best of times. I hate to use worst of times because, oh my goodness, that sounds really bleak. But, so I decided to say challenging times. Challenging times and yet hopeful times. And I think it really is both. So I want to share what we're seeing. And by the way, I know there's a workshop later today, which will be much more informal, but I hope you will jump in with a question or an observation as I go along. So feel free to jump in. Are you guys okay with that? Okay, great. Now let's see if this thing works. Aha, okay, great. Just another word, Dr. Poe did a great job of telling you about who we are. And we do want to be a resource to you, by the way. And I have two things here for you to take home. This is a brand new issue of a magazine we put out 2 or 3 times a year. And the reason why this is a great resource, it's the first time anywhere in America that anybody's attempted to talk about how churches can think about transitioning their space, rethinking their space. So there's a foldout here in the middle of this issue that kind of has a flow chart for the decision making that congregations should consider if they need, if they're stretched, if they're stressed, if there's an opportunity to use space in new ways or generate funds in new ways, or they may need to rethink who uses their space or even who owns their building. This flow chart kind of lays out those decision points. And also there's a page on what I call an ecosystem of nonprofits that are there to help you and your congregations think about these things, including partners. So this is the first time, and it was a lot of work to figure out how to design this and share it with you. So we think this will be an evergreen publication for us. There are lots of copies around. Feel free to take as many as you'd like. Some of the chairs in the front are not occupied, so just take 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, please. And then, I'll be talking more about this later on, but we have a guide to transitioning sacred places. I'll describe what that really means. That's kind of a new term that's in our field. Basically, it means a congregation may need to rethink its relationship to its building. It may need to rethink how the spaces are used. It may need to rethink ownership. It may need to even sell. And how do you do that in a civic-minded way? So this is a great guide. I have about half a dozen copies here. You're welcome to take one free. So I have that too. Okay, so as Dr. Poe said, we're really kind of unique. We're really honored that the Lilly Endowment has entrusted us with a lot of money to make capital grants to older and historic churches, as you may know. We'll talk about that a little bit more later today. Your congregation or the others you know may qualify for the National Fund, and the grants are up to $500,000 now. So they're considerable. So this may be, I won't dwell on that a whole lot today, but it's something you should know about. But we were founded in 1989, and the second funder for our work was the Lilly Endowment, and we're so honored that they've stayed with us for 36 years without interruption. And the National Fund is the biggest single program that they've supported. And you know, our point of view from the very beginning, I think one reason why we inspired confidence with funders like Lilly is that we care about the congregation and the neighborhood. So it's not just the building for its own sake, but how is this an asset and a resource? And how do you maximize this asset? How do you keep it going? How do you make the most of the space? How do you invite your community in? So we'll talk about some of those things. So it really is, you act it out, or you operate it as a civic place. And you kind of do that already, but how do you do that in even a bigger way? And so we really believe in healthy congregations and healthy neighborhoods. And that's kind of at the essence of what we do. And you'll see here, this is a Catholic church in South Chicago that had a terrible fire. And the order that owns and runs this building was determined to rebuild. So they are part of our national fund, and they actually rebuilt this church. All that was left were the walls and that tower. and now it's an operating Catholic parish again in south side of Chicago, in a really poor neighborhood. So you might have thought there was no hope, but they have really turned it around. I need to have another photo showing the after, before and after. So just another word about us. So we're an advocate, and I'm going to tell you a bit about what we've learned that helps us advocate for you. That's our job, is to help advocate. You know, we do it at a national level, but we also can do it at the local level. And if you're intrigued by any of this, let us know. We might be able to help you as you articulate your public value. We're going to talk about the halo effect of your church. That is one way to tell your story. So we're an advocate that's based in research, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We're really about your mission and your purpose, and the building as a tool to help you do your work. And so in our world of preservation, which sometimes gets too caught up in the details of bricks and mortar, what we say is we're about function, purpose, as much as the building itself. And again, it's the larger community. So we really focus a lot on the neighborhood, or if you're in a more rural area, it may be the larger community around you, the larger county. So we care about the larger area around you. Well, I don't have to tell you this. You live it. You know that a lot of our congregations are stressed and stretched, and they're smaller, and they face repair issues that may be. How many of you have congregations that face repair issues that may be hard to keep up with? So maybe half of you at least, okay? So you can identify with this, right? But there's hope. But this is the challenging part. Congregations are smaller. We'll talk a bit more about that. Older buildings. You know, if you've got a building from, 10 years old, then you're probably fine. But if you've got something older. By the way, historic, we use that term a lot. We try to be flexible. But in my world, historic now includes buildings built in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s. So fairly recent buildings. You know the term mid-century? Mid-century design? Well, mid-century is the hottest category in design right now. So if you have a building, post-war building, it probably has cultural and architectural merit. You may not have really thought that way before, but it probably does. And again, there's a lot of transition going on. Congregations are not, you guys are probably not using your buildings like you were using them in 1960 or 1930 or 1975. You just aren't. For example, Sunday schools are not what they used to be. That's one example. In my field, we often talk about Sunday school wings. Think of the innumerable thousands of Sunday school wings that were built in the 50s and 60s. You can picture them, right? And now they're often half empty. We deal with a lot of churches where they're pretty much totally empty. They don't have so many kids anymore. So what do you do with that space? So we'll talk more about that. So challenging times. Let's get a little more specific. Again, you know this as well as I do. About half of all congregations have fewer than 50 attending worship. And that number has gone down by half in the last decade. This is data we all read. We all read the same data sources. Another interesting thing you may not have heard as much about is the average, about half have an annual operating budget of less than $100,000. And let me tell you, you know this, but I can tell you this too. $100,000 a year hardly covers basic building repairs, let alone salaries and everything else, right? It's astonishing to think how congregations are stretched to try to keep this building going with such a small budget. And building costs are the second biggest expense on average for a congregation. First is probably personnel, including you guys, and maybe a part-time secretary and maybe a sexton, et cetera, but then buildings next, right? So what does this do? This leaves a lot of congregations vulnerable. And our sacred place is disappearing. Well, I think you know the answer to that too, don't you? You see churches closing. They don't always go away. Sometimes another congregation will move in, right? But the data seems to suggest about 1% of our churches we're losing 1% a year. Now, there's churn. Sometimes another congregation will move in, or that building will take on a new purpose, but sometimes they're lost altogether, and it's basically a community asset that's lost. So that's kind of what we're seeing. The likeliest to disappear, again, no surprise, the really small ones, are likely because they're barely hanging on. Storefront churches, house churches, and of course, if a building's in poor repair, that just adds to the stress. So that's one reason why it's not just about buildings, it's about the health and survival of the congregation if you are able to be good stewards of what you have and to make good use of it and to attract new funding. So we'll talk about all those things. Does this all sound familiar to you? This is a landscape you know well. You live it. So that's the challenging part. This is the hopeful part. You may know less about this. Capital assistance programs have sprung up. The National Fund for Sacred Places, which I mentioned before, and I'll say a bit more about that later, we've raised about $80 million for that fund so far. And so we'll bring in about 30 to 40 churches every year, and those grants tend to be about $500,000. They need to be matched. There are some things you might like to know, but if this intrigues you at all, be sure to ask me questions about that either now or this afternoon. But there's also a fund for black churches that's so specific for African American congregations. And there are some regional programs. We actually have our own black church program in Philadelphia, but there are programs working with Nordic churches in the upper Midwest. They tend to be Lutheran. There's a program we have in Appalachia that includes some capital money. So, and in New York State, there's been capital money. And by the way, about half the states, every state has a preservation office. You may not know that as part of the state government. About half of those preservation offices do make grants to churches, despite the separation of church and state. Some states don't do it, some states do. So depending on where you are, how many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you have congregations in Oklahoma? How many of you are much further away? So some of you have come some distance, right? Okay, so you might want to look at that because there is more government money available than there used to be. The other thing I'll talk more about is consulting services and hand-holding and planning and support. So if you're thinking, if some of what I'm saying really resonates with you and you're thinking, man, we really do need to think about our space in a new way and we might need a little help. There's a lot of help to be had. And again, this issue of the magazine does have a page devoted to groups. So if you're really ambitious, you might be saying, well, we'd like to build affordable housing on our parking lot. There's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of news on that, but that's an ambitious, daunting project for most congregations. That's not to say it's not good, it can be good, but for your average congregation, that's a lot to take on. But you may want to do something less ambitious. You might say, well, our Sunday school wing is empty. So let's invite the community in to talk to us about what this could be. So you have existing space that you could develop in new ways. So anyway, the consultants are there. Some do real estate development. Some are about helping to plan and do strategic thinking. We actually believe, by the way, that congregations should have a strategic plan for their building. There should be a mission statement for your building, separate from your overall mission statement, that you should really think about what is our building's purpose? And how does that fit in with our congregation's purpose? Most congregations have not thought about this. And so we help congregations go through a process to really think about what do we want this building's purpose to be and how do we live that out. So again, there are consultants that can deal with various pieces of this. So this is what we call the ecosystem. And this has grown up very, very fast. I've been in this field since we were founded in '89, so I've been doing this 37 years. This ecosystem is only 5 to 8 years old because things are changing so fast. So many congregations are worried. So many congregations have opportunities too. It's the challenge and the hopefulness, both, And I think a lot of congregations are looking for some help. Maybe we need to build something. Maybe we need to rethink our space. Maybe we need to raise money in new ways. We'll talk about money in a minute. So that's why this ecosystem. These people, by the way, meet every month. There's an actual affinity group, and they're online, and they talk to each other, and we're in those calls too. Just a little side note, we've been comparing notes with our peers in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, which of course their buildings are so much older and they have their own issues and they also have in some ways more money, but not enough. You probably have heard about what happens in England. But in terms of helping a congregation talk to its community and reimagine its space, we're way ahead of them. So I was there a few months ago to compare notes and to give a talk, and in some ways they're way ahead of us, and in some ways we're way ahead of them. And so they were intrigued by some of our tools to help congregations think about their space and talk to their community. So we'll talk more about that. So, there was almost nothing available when I started in the mid-'80s. So in the course of 40 years, the landscape has changed a lot. Congregations are more stressed and more worried. On the other hand, there's more to offer. And I think congregations feel a little less alone than they would have 40 years ago. So that's a hopeful thing. Any questions so far? All right. Oh, yeah, uh-huh. Yes. And so it also relates, if you have your magazine, go to page 21. This is not the complete ecosystem, but basically the ecosystem, it's a community of nonprofits that have formed to help congregations through the process of thinking about, do we want to use our building differently? Do we want to share it differently? Do we want to fund it differently? Maybe does ownership need to change? And not just the building, but the open space. Some of you may have a lot of open space around you. So to help a congregation through that process, and that, and the previous pages, so that would be page 18 and 19 and 20, it kind of is a guide for how a congregation can kind of go through this, ask some questions, and if it's yes, go this way, and if it's no, go this way. It kind of is a guide for how to think about your choices and think about your options. That's partly what this ecosystem is about, is to help congregations know there are options. Because, I think a lot of congregations feel overwhelmed, like, oh my God, what do we do? Yes? Does that include actually congregations who are looking to purchase properties? Yes. So you might need to expand, or you might need to rethink about, well, we have way too much space. So yes, it can. Oh yes, for sure. Absolutely. Yes. And in fact, in Indiana, we do a lot of work with Episcopal parishes. And in most cases, they're smaller, so they need to rethink what they have. In some cases, they want to purchase a building, they want to establish a presence. So some of the same process is useful for either situation. So now I want to talk about something that you may not have heard before. I think this is really, really interesting. And when we do training to help congregations articulate their value, tell their story, talk to their neighbors, that kind of thing, we start with this. And I hope you'll find this really useful. We've been doing this public value work for 30 years, and I think it's still one of the most powerful things we can talk about, which is that the way you use your space, the way you serve your people, the way you invite your community in brings public value. But there was no data on this. So when we started, I remember there was a board meeting of my organization in like 1995. So that's not that long ago for those of us who've been around a while. Our treasurer from Boston, who was rather a cantankerous guy, said, well, if we're trying to make a case for our older churches, shouldn't we know what goes on in them? I mean, because it is about more than architecture. Yeah, you may have beautiful buildings. That's important too. I confess I'm a preservationist. But we should know how you share your space and who you serve. So this is the mid-'90s, not that long ago, I like to think, and we started to ask around. And I know I'm in a seminary, so I hope no offense is taken, but we asked around with seminaries, and no one had done any research looking at how church spaces were used and shared and who benefited. No one knew. No seminary knew. We went to religious studies programs. Surely they would know. Nope. We went to judicatories, denominational offices. Surely some of them would know. We went to city planning offices, preservation programs, and universities. Well, you can begin to see the pattern. No one knew anything. So that's what let us, we're a service organization largely, but we realized we better work with somebody to try to measure or to try to determine what happens in our church buildings during the week. And by the way, this relates to the communication issue that we'll talk more about later. In my opinion, each church here, not just nationally, that's the story we tell, each church should be able to articulate public value and the way you share your space and who benefits. But in the mid-'90s, none of that was known. So who is served? Do you open up your building sacrificially? Almost always, yes, right? What's the culture value, and do your buildings strengthen your neighborhoods? Well, you probably have a sense they do, you do, but we didn't have any data. So that's what led us to this first publication. And by the way, both this one and the next one I'll talk about are on our website. You can download a PDF, or if you want, I think the folks here at Phillips can give you my email address. It's also in the magazine. Let me know and I can send you hard copies. Like if you'd like some of your governing body members to have a copy, let me know. So we called it Sacred Places at Risk. It's kind of a misnomer because that applies, well, we're worried about churches being lost and demolished, which is true. But this study was less about that. It was really about the question of who benefits from our churches. And it was unbiased, and it was a random sampling of older churches, not necessarily really old, like 1960s maybe, 1970s, across several cities across the country. So this was mostly an urban look at how churches are shared and used. Never been done before. What we learned is almost every church opens its doors. You know that. What you may not know is that almost everything you do to serve people happens in your building. You do other things. You may support a missionary, you may support something downtown, whatever. But most of your outreach happens in your building. That's the headquarters. There's a lot of volunteer time. You know that, right? And maybe not just members, maybe others from the community step in to help with your outreach. And there's a dollar value too. Let me see if I can go back. Yeah, I think there's a pie chart missing, but we'll get into it. But basically what we learned is that, and this was astounding, when we share this with pastors, most will say they've never heard this before. 8 out of 10 of the people who are served by programs in your building are not members. You know this, right? But the data had never been gathered before. And so I see I hear some murmuring and nodding the heads, but I can guarantee it. Your mayors don't know this. Your community foundations do not know this. Your local banks do not know this. Your leading donors and philanthropists in your city do not know this. They do not know that you are serving as a civic place. City planners do not know. Thank you for saying that. City planners do not know. All the civic leaders in your communities have never been asked to think about this. Sadly, they see a disciples church and they think it's for disciples only. And they see the Methodist church and they think that's for Methodists. Or a Baptist church and they think it's for Baptists. And you know what? That's partly our own fault. All of us. Because we're not articulating this. We're not telling that story. And not to digress just for a quick second, but I like to say this when we're talking to pastors. Okay, you're driving down the road through some small town and you're driving by the Methodist church and there's a sign on the lawn typically, right? What does that sign say? Do you have a chicken noodle dinner at your church? Okay, so there may be an event coming up. What else does that mean, that big sign that's always there? What does it say? Pardon? Worship times, the name of the church, pastor's name often. Yeah, it might give you like 9:30 and 11 o'clock or whatever. It might say when it was founded. Founded, 1910 or something, right? What does it not say? Typically, it does not tell you anything about what happens in that building during the week. And that is a serious fault for all of us. And we believe strongly, that's at the heart of all the things we do, is to help congregations tell their story. And part of your story is how you share your space. And the fact that 80%, and by the way, I'll share more data in just a second, it's now up to almost 90%. Maybe because congregations are shrinking. So the people you're serving are less and less likely to be your members and more likely to be others. So now almost 90% of the people you serve are not members. What does that say? What should that say to your county community foundation that might help you? What should that say to them? Invest. Why should they invest? Exactly. You're in effect a de facto community center for most of the week. That's not to deny or diminish your worship time and your Christian education, all those good things. That's not denying that. But it's important to flesh out the story, and that's what our data shows. For most of the week, most of the people you serve are not your members. And again, we need to tell that story, because when we need to fix the roof, or we want to make the building more accessible, or we need to replace the bathrooms, things that serve people, or replace the furnace, and it's an $80,000 bill, or it's a $200,000 bill, or whatever, and it's more than we can handle, we should, and you can't wait too late. You can't, when the furnace fails, it's a little late to go to your community fund. I mean, you still can, but it's a little, you should have been in conversation with these people all along, and they should have come to realize your value. And so when the time comes, you can go to them for help. So we really believe that story needs to be told. So that first study was really about how you share your space and who benefits. And by the way, when you do that, there's a lot you put in that space, because that space has value. If that daycare center had to move from your church to someplace else, and they had to pay rent, so that's basically gives you a sense of what your space is worth. But you tend to put in staff time, volunteer time, in-kind support, cash support. So all that really adds up. And that's basically you're subsidizing, often to a significant degree. You're sacrificially opening up your building. And again, we know this, but your civic leaders do not. So that was that first study. But then we began to realize, wait, there's so much more to this story. There's so much more that you do. And we decided to call this larger effect the halo effect, because it's how you spend your money. It's how people come to the community and they spend money. It's your effect on people's lives. It's the open space, recreational space, things like that you offer. So we actually looked at 40 to 50 factors. By the way, that first study and the second study was with the University of Pennsylvania. Interestingly, the School of Social Work. Not religious studies, not architecture, which is the two fields you might think would do this, but no, social work, because they've been interested in the community impact of faith-based organizations. This goes back to the days of George W. Bush. Remember that whole big debate, government versus church, which was a false debate, really. It's not like government can just leave it to the church. But anyway, so in the middle of that, by the way, one of our advisors to this study ended up becoming the first director of the White House Office on Faith-Based Initiatives. Remember those days? Which is, I think, I'm not sure if Trump still has that office, but it continued over several other administrations. So the research I'm going to share today actually influenced the federal government. And you may not know this, every major federal department has a faith-based office, including ones you wouldn't think, like Department of Agriculture. HHS and HUD you'd expect, right? Because they're dealing with cities and housing and all that, but Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture. And why agriculture? Any guesses on that for those of you who live in smaller towns? Pardon? Well, yes, all those things, and often in a more rural area, the church may be the only public space for all these things to happen. In an urban area like Tulsa, there's many, many churches, but in a small town, there may be very few. So the agriculture department recognizes that. So anyway, that's where that came from. This data I'm going to share with you influenced federal policy. So this is something astonishing. We looked at all these factors. The average urban, we'll talk about rural in a minute. The average urban church has an economic impact of $1.7 million a year, every year. And again, I can guarantee no civic leader in your town knows this. They've never been asked to think about it. It includes daycare, preschool, after school, your operating budget. It includes things like what we call the magnet effect. Nobody's ever thought about this. When you do things and serve people, and people are drawn into your neighborhood, and they spend money in town, that's your magnet effect. Why are they spending money nearby? It's because you brought them there. Now, you may think that's minor, but it isn't minor. And number two, This is the argument made by every county and every city when they invest in like a convention center or a civic center, or if you're in a big city like a stadium. Their argument is, well, people come into town and they spend money. But for every convention center, there are 100 churches doing the same thing. You bring people in, you draw people in, and they spend money. So that's another part. So why do we use this term halo effect? Because you can picture your church on a map. Just picture your church on a map, and you have radiating circles of influence in your neighborhood and your town. And of course, it's a nice play on words to call it the halo effect. But that is what is happening here. Your spending, most of your spending stays local, by the way. Some of it goes elsewhere, but most of it stays local. When you think about flowers and catering and singers and carpenters and all the people you hire, most of it's local, right? Now look at, this echoes something I said earlier. Look at that bottom pie chart. So this study was about 80 to 90 congregations, and half of them spent less than $100,000 over 5 years on their building. What is that per year? $20,000, right? $20,000 per year. That is nothing. How many of you deal with property? Obviously, if you're pastors, but how many of you have active property committees and really think a lot about your building and invest in your building? I mean, you kind of have to do that, right? $20,000 a year? How many of you could get by with that kind of money to make the repairs you need to make? Especially when every 5 or 10 years you've got to make a major, major investment. So we'll talk more about that. This is kind of astonishing. Again, this is, just remember, about 90 congregations. Now this is, I find this amazing. 90 congregations, all the people coming and going over the course of 1 year, almost 3.7 million people coming and going over the course of a year to these 90 congregations. Now look at the pie chart below. What percentage is coming for worship? 11%. 11%. Now, is that a good thing? Or is that a scary thing? What did I hear? Both. Both? How is it both? Anybody want to volunteer? Why is it both? Good and bad. Okay, why is it bad? Pardon?
It looks very small to us, and we keep having this, I don't know if it's an illusion or an aspiration, but a lot more people will come to worship.
And we want that. And we want that, right? So that's, we do want more people in the pews. Excuse me. But look at it. Half are coming for community programs. Is that a good thing? It echoes what we've been saying this last half an hour. So we want that. We want our buildings to serve as places for outreach and program for people in need. We want that. But we also want more people coming to worship. We want both, right? But that's kind of fascinating. And on the left-hand side, it talks about the magnet effect. So that's about a fifth. That's huge. Think about $1.7 million on average per year. A fifth of that is people coming to your town or your neighborhood, and they may spend the night if it's a wedding. They might buy a meal. They might fill up their tank with gas. They might do some shopping. So, by the way, this is based on interviews. So when we did this study, we spent time with each church in person and interviewed the pastor, the treasurer, the people who ran the programs to get all this data on people being served, money being spent. We talked to the Tourism and Visitors Bureau to find out what did people spend on average for a night at a hotel? What did people spend on average for dinner in that town? Because it varies. Tulsa is very different than a small town, say. So that's how we got this data. And as I was saying before, the percentage of people who you serve that are not your members has actually gone up. It was around 80%, now it's almost 90%. We're not entirely sure why, except the congregations have gone smaller. That's our best guess. And we don't want to forget that you also have an impact on individual lives. Now, when we first did this study, there was a lot of rancor and debate on our board about this. Like, how do we measure your impact on a couple that you help stay together rather than getting divorced? That's a good thing for society, right? It's a good thing for them, hopefully. It's a good thing for society. So here's something you probably can measure. When you help someone get a job, or do job training or ESL classes so they're better, get a better job. You can measure that impact, right? How about if you prevent somebody from committing suicide? Our board didn't like that. But you know, in the social work community, they have no problem measuring the economic impact. I see some nodding of heads. For someone who stays alive. The problem is, it's hard to know for how long, and it's hard to know if the pastor was the main factor. But still, you know, there are ways to kind of filter through that and be really, really conservative. So in the first study, we did not include some of these things, and more recently we have, as we felt a little more comfort with them. Incubation. This is something, again, you know, what I'm trying to do is suggest some things that can help you tell your story. Incubation. Almost every church has incubated good things. Maybe a small nonprofit that needed a home, affordable home. Maybe a small business that started in your kitchen. What have you incubated? What have you provided a welcoming, affordable home for something, and then they may have moved on? And a good example, I was active at First Presbyterian Church in downtown Philadelphia. I'm from Philly. For years, and in the era when AIDS sprung up and terrified everybody, they started something called Manna, and they made homemade hot meals for people who were homebound with HIV or AIDS. And people like me would volunteer to pick them up and walk them over to the person where they lived and deliver it. And it was called Manna, and it was offered free space to cook and to pack and to prepare it for the volunteers to take it to someone's home. Manna is now in its fourth home. It's no longer at First Presbyterian Church. That was like, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago. They've moved on to 2 or 3 other places. They've grown enormously. And now, of course, since the complexion of AIDS has changed, they still have the purpose of making hot meals for people who are homebound, but it could be for something else. They may have some other reason that they can't get out to get a good hot meal. But the purpose is still the same, to bring hot meals to people in their homes when they can't get out. And they're in their fourth home, and they've grown. But what made it all possible? First Presbyterian Church. And you might think about this when of course, some of you may have been in your church a long time, and maybe some of you more briefly, but it's a good conversation to have with your lay leaders, is what have we helped over the years? And if we, again, are trying to make a case to a funder or a donor, we need to tell that story. That we've been open to supporting things that needed a welcoming home. Does anybody know of an example that your church has done this? Offhand? Yes. What was your example?
So we had a longtime member who started a cookie business in her own kitchen, and then she outgrew that and needed larger commercial space, and we have a commercial kitchen. And so we offered that to her. She paid us a small rent monthly until she outgrew our space, and is now in a storefront and is wildly successful and has full-time employees. And it's been sad for us because now we don't get free cookies every day.
I love that.
But that's the incubation side of it.
Exactly. And that's also an argument for commercial kitchens, because when we work with churches on thinking about their space, it's very common that they have a space that's just short of qualifying for commercial. So they may need better ventilation, they may need a grease trap. There are certain things that cities require they don't quite have, or the equipment's so old it needs to be replaced, but they realize there's an opportunity to do things like that, or else do food ministries in some new ways. So, but that's a great example. So I would encourage you, as you go back and think about what we've talked about today, to think about instances like that. This is a part of your story. This is a part of your case. We talk a lot about case statements. And the reason this relates to buildings is for you to maximize the use and care of your building, you need help, almost always. How many of you have congregations that are completely self-sufficient? But you know, in 1960, a lot of churches would have raised their hands, but not now. So if we're not self-sufficient, then we need to reach out. But to reach out, we need to have an argument to make. You know, we need to be persuasive. So that's why we're doing this. Okay, rural. So that was all urban, 1.7 million. We did the same study with Methodist churches in North Carolina. You can probably guess who funded that if you know anything about Methodism. That's the Duke Endowment. They have a program for rural Methodist churches in North Carolina. So they funded this, and this amount is close to $750,000. So the number is smaller, but that makes sense. Rural congregations are often smaller, the buildings are smaller, budgets are smaller, but it's still a very big number. And for the Duke Endowment, they wanted more ammunition to talk about the value of small town congregations in North Carolina and for the work they do to help those congregations. So I'm going to try to end. I don't know how much time I have because I was hoping for time for questions, with 3 principles that we like to share or we like to promulgate. And I hope they resonate with you. Your building is a portal between you and your community. It's a way for them to enter in, not literally, but also figuratively. And I think a lot of churches underestimate how many people love your building. They may not attend your services. They may be a different tradition. They may not go to any church, but they appreciate your presence. The problem is, a lot of churches are not seeking them out in a proactive way, but they are there. I actually think the building is one of the easiest ways to get the community interested in you. I'll give you an example. They walk by, say you have a Gothic church from 1925, just making that up. There are a lot of Gothic churches from the 1920s. So somebody who's Catholic goes by your building and says, God, I love that building. So let's just say it's, First Christian Church, making that up. And they say, I love that building, and it's beautiful. I don't really understand why it looks the way it does. Why is it Gothic? Why is it made with, brick and cast stone? What are the windows? I can't really quite see the windows from here, but it looks really cool. Most churches don't attempt to tell that story. But it's an easy way in. Those people may never worship with you, but they are interested in you. And so one of the things I encourage you to do is think about how do you tell the story of your place and how it's used. Again, I talked about, the placard in the front, which almost never says anything about your space and how you share that. But also, the building itself has a story to tell. Why does it look the way it does? Why is it laid out the way it does? Anybody know anything about the Akron Plan Sunday School? Anybody have one? Akron Plan was developed after the Civil War, very common throughout, except for the Episcopal Church. Most Protestant churches built Akron Plan as a Sunday school space. Many churches still have it, where you've got kind of a central open space and then classrooms ringing around. Does that ring a bell? You may have one, or you may have seen them. A lot of disciples churches, Methodist, et cetera, have them. Most churches have really no idea of why they look the way they do, and they haven't told their neighbors about that either. So neighbors have no idea that there's this innovative religious education approach. It's maybe empty most of the time now, but that story's never been told. Why does this church look the way it does? What style is it and why? Why is it built with certain materials? What spaces are inside? In the same period as the Akron Plan, again, I know you'll know this, is the theatrical plan sanctuary. You've all seen them. Maybe you have one. It's not the nave and aisles. It's not the Gothic plan. It's curving pews and sloping floors and the central pulpit platform. Anybody seen that? Anybody have one? Very, very common. Well, it's basically a theatrical plan, and it was meant to make it easy for everybody in those pews, even in the back pews, to easily see and hear the preacher, like you maybe. And it actually came, this is my thesis topic, which is why I can talk about it. It came actually from Broadway theaters, because there were preachers in places like New York City that were attracting enormous crowds, and the only place that could handle them were theaters. Mostly gone now, but we're talking about before the Civil War. And so when they started to build churches for preachers like that, they built them in a theatrical way. Therefore, curving pews, sloping floor, a big balcony, and a central place to preach from. Now, they've often been altered. We won't get into all those details now, but that they may have changed, but that's why they look the way they do. And you know what? People find that fascinating. It's a place for speakers and preachers, which is why it may be perfect for a community meeting, or for a concert, or for an assembly, or a town hall, right? They're perfect for that. But your neighbors do not know the story, and I think you have to tell them that story. So it's a representation of who you are. You know, I think it's the most accessible way for you to engage your community because they see it, they probably love it, but they don't understand it. And I think, and there's lots of ways to do this, we don't have time for all that now, but I encourage you to think about how do you invite the community to engage with you. And they appreciate that there's been constancy and continuity in an era, you know, thanks to Pastor Jenny earlier, you know, the Sturm und Drang of the moment is horrifying to all of us. But your church and your constancy and your dedication to serving people has been there for decades, or maybe for more than a century. And that's important to people around you. So how do you use all that to engage with them? My second principle said that's the first. Second is being connected in new ways. And I know you guys have community-minded congregations, so I'm not saying you don't do this. But I would encourage you to connect in new ways. And one of the things we often do is, especially for churches that have space that's underused. Does that sound familiar? Do some of you have underused space? Yeah, I mean, that's pretty universal now. Well, invite civic leaders in for a conversation about your space. And we've done this with small churches in Indiana and larger churches in Indiana. And a lot of congregations are a little hesitant. Like, oh, well, would they want to come? What would they want to talk about? So I remember going with this small town church, Episcopal church in northern Indiana, and the mayor came, and the head of the children's outreach services for the county came, and the people who did other outreach for the arts community came. About 8 people came, and they walked around the building, get a sense of what it had, and we pointed out what spaces were underused, and they sat down over coffee and cookies and talked. And it was only like an hour. And guess what? It resulted within 6 months in several new programs. The church ended up opening its space and using its space. And the rector, who was a skeptic at the beginning, was totally won over. She said, you know what? This has revolutionized the way we think about our space. Because these people came in and they saw things we did not see. They saw opportunities we did not see. And they came forward and said, we'd like to work with you. So that's an example of getting the community involved and helping you think about your space. Another one I recommend is having a good architect at your side. How many of you have an experienced architect with older churches, assuming you have an older church? How many of you have an architect at the ready? If you have a problem, if you need to do some planning, I see 1 hand. 2 hands, thank you. Highly recommend this. When we're talking about the National Fund, which I'll mention in a minute, we insist that a church work with a qualified architect to do planning. And if they haven't finished the planning, we will help pay for it. Because we think it's essential for a professional to help you identify all the issues, all the things you need to do, and prioritize them and give you costs. And the great thing about a good architect is they become your friend and your advocate for years. So they may help you do a plan in 2026, and maybe that leads to a capital campaign in 2027, and they will be your advisor for decades to come. And you can count on them to give you a dispassionate opinion, unlike a contractor. You know, that's not to put down contractors. There's lots of good, but they're in it because they want a job. Right? A roofer wants the job. Yes, I want to get to your question. But an architect is not, it's like a doctor. A doctor's not going to do the surgery, but they're going to give you advice on your body, right? An architect's really giving you advice on your architectural body. But they're not going to do the work. Yes?
A bad architect is much more expensive than a good one.
Yes.
What I mean by that is I've hired several architects in my ministry and never gotten their full attention. Regardless of what we paid them, the elevator that we paid for to put a casket in was turned the wrong way.
Uh-oh.
The same money would have done the job we wanted, and we thought we had that till it was finally installed. And it's that kind of thing. I just think you got to work to make sure you're all on the same page.
I totally agree. Thank you. And you are?
I'm paid for.
No, your name.
I'm Randy Williams.
Randy, great to meet you. Thank you for saying that. Well, and that's why we say talk to local preservation, if you have an older building, even if you have a building from the 1980s, that's still kind of older. So talk to a good firm, a good nonprofit to see who they recommend. You can talk to your state government office. They will have architects to recommend. Talk to other churches to see who, and maybe you did some of that, and then interview several and see if you're going to get their full attention. And is it going to be the principal or some associate? And look at the work they've done elsewhere, and take it seriously. So I'm glad you made that point because, and same with contractors. Let me tell you, there are so many horror stories of churches that have hired contractors and then been left like paid money, and the work was never really done properly or not done at all. So getting good advice on architects and contractors is essential. And the reason I bring this up is it's not just about a project, it's about a relationship. That's something we really believe in, is encouraging churches to develop new relationships. Why? Because, see the bottom bullet here? Please don't do this alone. Whether you're thinking about reimagining your space, sharing your space, funding your building in new ways, sharing your space, inviting the community in, all those things. There are a lot of people out there who can help you. So please, please, please don't do this alone. I think I saw a hand raised over here. Somebody raise their hand? Yes.
Yeah. I'm just starting from here, but I do a lot of work with preservation societies.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking for an architect, contact the Preservation Society. They'll have architects that are familiar with the local architecture, and they can get you to an architect.
Exactly. Totally agree with that. And not every city or county has that, but so if you're like 30 minutes from Tulsa, the people in Tulsa will still have some things to a firm can range 2 or 3 hours from their main office and still be effective. And again, every state government has a preservation office, by the way. All 50 states have that. So that's also, yes.
Having once been the administrative assistant for a church, know that we developed an excellent relationship with the general contractor over time. Because if you have an older church, yes, the contractor's in it for the job, but if you have an older church, you always have a job. And so they are very helpful in helping to modify what we call attention to things architects can do.
Yes.
You want a symbiotic relationship.
Yes. Yes.
Between your architect and your contractor and your church community. It's a three-way work.
Yes, that's really well said. Because the contractor will have been in all the nooks and crannies for many, many years. And also there are maybe subcontractors. So if you're talking about stained glass, how many of you have stained glass? Maybe half of you? That's a specialty area, and your average architect won't really know that much about the details of repairing stained glass. So they're going to want to find a good stained glass studio or a stained glass consultant, of which there are like 2 of them, very few. But a good studio or 2 can also come and give you some advice on what you may need to do. So yes, that whole world, I encourage you to get into that world a little bit. It may seem daunting, but it's really worthwhile. And again, it's about relationships. It's not just about getting that project done. And also donors. We haven't talked about fundraising a lot yet. We do a lot of capital campaigns for churches. And we have learned that if you tell your story in a powerful new way, and you reach beyond your members in an effective way, this is really important. 2/3 of your capital funds will come from non-members. 2/3, which is an astonishing amount, especially for a small congregation that's worried about, oh my goodness, how are we going to do all this? But it requires a story or a case. We call it a case statement. Like, why should people care about you? And if you really articulate that and get out into your community, whether it's foundations or wealthy individuals or neighbors or whatever, then you will uncover some new sources of support, which can really be encouraging when you're facing a big bill. So that's another kind of world. Architects, donors, neighbors, civic leaders are just some examples. And then reimagining your space. I find this reimagination term pretty effective. I think a lot of churches like that term because it doesn't mean destroying it. It means giving new life. What could it be? What could that Sunday school wing be? Could it simply be a series of offices for nonprofits? Could it be housing, small house, tiny houses? I know of one church in Syracuse, New York. That's what they're doing with their parish house. Used to house the bishop and the diocese, but they moved out, so they have all this empty space. So they're actually creating tiny houses in a couple floors of their parish house. One of the things that can help with that, we do a lot of asset mapping where work with churches to invite the community in, and together they give a lot of thought to what are the strengths of this building? What are the really great things you have? And what's happening in the larger community? And can you bring those things together to create something new with your space? If you've probably heard of asset mapping. And we practice it as you have church leaders, and you maybe have 20, 30 people from the community who get to know your building a little bit, and then they sit down with you and say, all right, that old parish hall, which we don't really use much anymore, or maybe it's the old dining room. We used to have monthly dinners, and we don't anymore. What could this be? What does our community need? Can we reimagine this? And the other piece, speaking of architects, is we often will do design charrettes. Have you ever heard of a design charrette? What's cool about it is it's a brief, intense design project where architects can come in with all the information. You may have done some asset mapping. You may have done some thinking about what we want to do with our space. And they look at the space and say, well, how could we reconfigure this? Not to destroy it, but to make it work in new ways. That's called a design charrette. It's a French word, and it means like a really intense, focused thing. And guess what? We've done this around the country, and we find that local architects will do this for free. It's pro bono, because they see you as a civic place. Maybe you haven't quite thought of it quite like that, but they see you as a civic asset, and they're willing to help. And often we'll work with the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects, which is kind of the trade association. I'm sure there's one in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and they often have a preservation or design kind of committee, and they will ask those architects if they'd like to work with you. That involves maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days of their time to get to know you, to tour the building, and then there's 2 intensive days where they sit down and say, all right, given what the church wants and given the input from the community, what could this space be? They're basically reimagining it or helping you. And they create drawings. So they're images. And you can use that to say, all right, we like this. Let's see if we can raise money to do this. We're excited about what this could be. So it can be a source for fundraising and community conversation. So I think there are a lot of ways for you to get some great input and get you really excited about what you can do with your space. Does that make sense? So I'm nearing the end. What we preach is managing your building differently, funding it differently. We talked a little bit about fundraising, sharing your spaces differently, or in a bigger way, because I know you share your space already. Can you do it in a bigger way? And then can you plan your stewardship? Can you think about your building's purpose? Just a couple words about what we do. We help build the capacity of congregations to do this. And by the way, if any of your denominational offices are interested, we can work with a group of churches to help you develop a case statement, think about your spaces in a new way, and raise money in new ways. And we call it new dollars, new partners for your sacred place. So we do this with groups of congregations. We could do this with your denominational leadership. So if this intrigues you, let me know. We do a lot of work to help congregations talk to their neighbors. I mentioned the kind of inviting a few people in for coffee idea. By the way, that sounds so simple and elementary, right? But guess what? Most churches don't do this. And so we've had pastors say, oh my goodness, this was so great. Simple, but you helped us kind of structure it and think about it and think about who to invite. So it sounds really basic, but it's really helpful. Community-wide fundraising and space matching. Another word about the National Fund, and I can tell you much more this afternoon. So right about now, I don't suppose any of you are embarking on a capital project, but if you are, we accept applications in January and February. So once a year, we have a 2-month window. We tend to get 300 to 500 applicants from around the country. We work with all faith traditions, older buildings that have serious investments that they are needed. And it's not just the roof and the tower and the windows. It's also maybe you need to put in a new HVAC system, a new ventilation and air conditioning and heating. Maybe you need new bathrooms to serve the kids that are in your building. Maybe you need better accessibility. So it's about not just the envelope. Architects use that term for the outside, but it's also to make your spaces work better. So and our grants are up to $500,000. It does require a match. It means that the congregation receiving this has to raise an equal amount over the course of 2 or 3 years, which is typically doable. It requires a church that's reasonably healthy, obviously not dying, because there's no point in investing. But we invest in a lot of small congregations. So if you know of small congregations that are reasonably steady and not dying, then they might qualify for this. So we also want churches that are serving the community. You know, some churches are very inward looking. Knowing you a little bit, I suspect that's not what you are. You're very outward looking. So those are some of the things we look for, and I can talk more about that this afternoon. So, and then this is the yellow book I just mentioned. So again, this is a resource. Your Methodist bishop or your disciples leaders, whatever tradition you're from, this might be a useful tool for them. So if you think some of the people in your tradition would like a copy, let us know. Again, I have a few copies with me today. And that's it. Thank you. I have not been paying attention to the clock.
We have a few more minutes of anyone would like to ask questions, but let's do that with a mic so our online folks can be included. And then I'll have some instructions for lunch.
So any questions? Don't be shy.
So I'll ask my question then.
Sure, please. Yeah, get the ball rolling.
So what in your experience, what's the project killer? What's the thing? I mean, you talked about a vital congregation. I get that, but are there other this is just you should do something else?
Well, a lot of congregations don't have very compelling projects, and it may be because they haven't really thought it through with their community. I remember I live in West Philadelphia, right near a Methodist church that's going strong now, but that church almost closed. It's an example of a Akron plan, auditorium plan church with Tiffany windows, really grand building. They almost closed. So when the neighbors, including me, stepped forward to help them, they started to say, well, okay, maybe we don't need to close. Let's think about what to do with our space. And they had this enormous basement below the auditorium plan sanctuary, so this huge space below. And they said, well, we need daycare. So let's put a daycare center in here. Based on what? That's my thought. Based on what? Well, so it was not based on any community input. They just, I guess a lot of churches assume daycare is needed everywhere, right? Kids are needed. They need that kind of space. And that may be the case for many, many neighborhoods. But in this case, it actually did not make sense. And that's not what was done. So I think we want to see some evidence that a church has an important place, needing investment, a reasonably healthy congregation, can match the funds we grant, and are committed to serving the community, but are also talking to their community. They're not doing this alone. That's what we look for.
Okay, coming along with that, so in terms of the data points that community governmental leaders might be looking for, what data points have you found in the research that are most persuasive or helpful?
Well, we want to see some evidence. One of the problems we sometimes see with churches is they're full of dreams, but it's not very real. And so we want to see some evidence. And by the way, any funder, not just us, we're kind of a funder as well as a helper, right? But if they're going to go to a foundation, same issue. If they're saying, oh, our dream is to make this into a center for the homeless or whatever, which is all very noble, but if they've got no history, and they haven't done their homework, and they haven't done it before, then we're going to be highly skeptical. So I think any funder will look at, do you have the capacity? Do you have the leadership? Do you have a track record? Do you have good financial records? A lot of congregations, their systems are not really great. And so a funder will wonder, well, are you going to be able to keep track of your expenses? Are you going to be responsible steward of the money we give you? So those are some things we look at.
Anyone else? All right, I said lunch, so that's all right. So we are headed to lunch. Lunch is in the Cadjo building. It's so cool that we now have to say what building we're going to. So Cadjo building, which is next door. Also, if you have requested a special meal, please go to the Killen Commons. That's where the kitchen is. Those will be there, but we are in the Chapman Commons for lunch. and the Killen Commons. So, but if you do have a special meal that you've requested, please go to the Killen Commons to get that. So we are dismissed until our next session. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.